Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today's founder is Arthur Lee, a diplomat during the Revolutionary War who comes from the Lee family of Virginia, a very powerful, well-connected family of whom you're probably familiar with at least one or two people. Now, Arthur ends up going as a young man to London to study medicine, and he does this successfully and becomes a physician. It's about that time that the Stamp Act crisis breaks out, and he pens a popular letter defending the actions of the Stamp Act Congress back in New York City. It's also about this time he decides to take up a second profession, lawyer. He studies law and becomes a lawyer and becomes pretty successful at it. He's also hired by the colony of Massachusetts to act as their colonial agent, essentially their representative to Parliament and the Crown. During this time, he communicates directly with Samuel Adams back in Massachusetts because Adams was one of the leaders of the colonial assembly, and that helps radicalize Arthur a little bit. He also works closely with Benjamin Franklin, who was there representing Pennsylvania and several other colonies, and although they do work together, they don't exactly have the closest relationship, and in fact, Arthur generally criticizes Ben Franklin for his life of opulence, what he sees as hedonism. Although we all know who Ben Franklin was and how much fun he could be. That being said, this was a really important relationship to have a little bit of anger in the middle of later on. You see, once the Revolutionary War breaks out, Arthur having sided with the Patriots, it's not a great idea to stick around in London, so he and his younger brother William both leave London, and they are both actually appointed as diplomats by the Continental Congress about this time. William goes off to Eastern Europe. Arthur Lee is both in charge of Prussia and Spain, which seems a little difficult at the time because they're pretty far apart from each other. Well, he doesn't have much luck with either of those nations, but he does eventually get moved over to France. And when he arrives in France, it's about the same time Ben Franklin arrives in France, and they're both joining Silas Deane, who was already in that nation, sending back supplies and uniforms and officers to help the fight. Now, Lee had already not liked Ben Franklin before this, as we mentioned, and he really doesn't like Silas Deane. Now, truth be told, it seems he's a little jealous of Deane for being able to establish better connections with Versailles than Lee was able to establish. And in fact, he starts writing home talking trash about both Franklin and Silas Deane. And while at this point it was very hard for people to not like Benjamin Franklin because the status, the level of importance he had achieved in society both before and during the American Revolution, Silas Deane was a little bit of a lesser known quantity. In fact, he had been taken out of the Continental Congress by his home colony of Connecticut. Unfortunately, the truth of the matter is Silas Deane's an American hero, and he's almost, I don't want to say single-handedly, but almost single-handedly got the supplies and men to help win the Battle of Saratoga, which turns the tide and finally gets France to support the United States as an independent nation and join the war. Now, Arthur Lee is there during this time, and he, with Deane and Franklin, signed the treaties of commerce and alliance with France. So Deane does have his name on those documents, despite being the one character who is not happy with the goings-on of the time. But because Arthur Lee has several brothers, as I mentioned, including Francis Lightfoot Lee and Richard Henry Lee, who were both in the Continental Congress and signers of the Declaration of Independence, they believe their brother when he writes home and says, hey, Franklin and this guy Deane are doing a terrible job. And he actually accuses Deane of embezzling money. Truth of the matter is, Deane was acting covertly for the first few years and therefore had to mix his personal transactions into the books with his dealings with France, because again, France was keeping its actions helping the Americans secret before the official alliance formed. When Deane arrives home on the head ship of the French fleet alongside the admirable admiral of the French Navy and the first minister to the United States from any other nation, he assumed he'd be greeted as a hero. He should have been greeted as a hero, but unfortunately, he was put on trial because the corruption accusations that Arthur Lee seemingly made up. Yes, unfortunately, this is one founder where I'm trying to be as unbiased as possible, but I am a little bit biased because I am a big Silas Deane fan, and Arthur Lee was an anti-Deane. That being said, eventually, because of these accusations, Dean eventually being cleared of all wrongdoing, Arthur Lee having made these baseless accusations, he too is eventually recalled, which is unfortunate for him because he does not get to sign the Treaty of Paris. Instead, he comes back to the United States for the first time in 25 years. And when he does, well, he's all right. He's both a physician and a lawyer and a member of one of the wealthiest families in the entire nation. So he gets by just fine. He's very quickly elected to the Continental Congress himself, and he spends several years there during the 1780s. Unfortunately, because people are starting to not trust him anymore, he does kind of fade back from the leadership. And additionally, as I said, Richard Henry Lee is the leader of the family, despite Thomas Ludwell Lee being the oldest and really the one overseeing most of the actions of the family plantations and such. Lee does one last thing. When the when the United States Constitution is presented for ratification, Arthur Lee writes a popular pamphlet against it. He becomes an anti-federalist. He does think that it would lead to tyranny, and he publishes a fairly popular article before essentially retiring to his physician practice, his first love, and he does pursue being a doctor for the remainder of his life. So that's the brief overview of the story of Arthur Lee, one of the anti-heroes of the American Revolution. He did some good things, and he did, publish important papers. He did try to help in his own way in foreign diplomacy, although, as I clearly mentioned, he did kind of hold back the revolution. He held back some of the heroes of the revolution. But either way, that's Arthur Lee. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit like so more people can learn about the channel and learn about American history with us. And if you're new here, subscribe for another founder 7 days a week. I'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow.